Greetings everybody and welcome to another tutorial. In this one we'll be taking a look at the new Toon shading feature that got introduced in Corona 13. With this new functionality, what you can now do is you can render out non-photorealistic cartoon-like renders. And so this can be useful for example, early drafts where you want to communicate something as a work in progress, or maybe in situations where you want to avoid deep decisions about just what kind of, for example, wood material should be used during the design and layout stages, things like that, right? Or it can be even a stylistic choice. So sometimes, especially in ArcViz, you want to showcase the overall shapes and figures without necessarily bogging things down with realistic details. Or sometimes your client wants to avoid setting specific expectations to their customers about how a space will look. So use cases are plenty, hence why this was one of the more often requested features. Now, broadly speaking, the feature set is split into two parts. First is the Toon material, which you can use to define the look of the materials in your scene. And the second one is an outline material, which is used to create outline effects on objects. You can, of course, combine the two approaches. You can just do the outlines, even on photorealistic renders, or you can put outlines on things, plus make the materials look cartoony using the Toon material. On top of that, you can also just do the Toon material without any outlines. And the point here really is that you can pretty much do whatever you want. Right, so with all those very basics explained, let's now take a look at how the general workflow looks like. To set up outlines, as you might suspect, you'll need an outline material in your scene. This thing is what drives the outline generation, and if you just want to apply it to a single object, you can do just that, because it's just a material like any other material, and so it applies to things, well, just like any other materials would. Now, typically what you want to do is you want to apply it to pretty much everything in your scene. And that can get a bit tricky if you've got a rather large, complexer scene, such as the one that is in front of us right now. Fortunately for us though, there's this outline override available in the render settings that basically accepts an outline material and applies it to everything in the scene. In 3ds Max, this thing is located under the Scene menu and just below the Scene Environment overrides. In Cinema 4D, you can just simply go under the Scene Environment menu and you'll see the thing at the bottom there. Obviously, you can then go ahead and play around with the outline material settings to get it looking the way you want to. We will share some tips and tricks on some of the setups a bit later in this tutorial. Okay, now those are the very basics of the outline setup, and naturally you might also be interested in the Toon shading itself, right? Well, good news, the setup for Toon shading is rather similar. You'll need the Toon material and what you can do with it. You can just simply apply it to an object in your scene, and then you'll have that toony shaded look on it. And that's cool, but we'd like those outlines on there as well, probably, right? Well then, if that is what you want, you'll need to have that outline material applied to your object, the outline material, right? And then you'll notice the outline material has a base material slot to it. And that is where you'll want to plug in your actual material. Now that material can be a photoreal material, or in our case here, it's going to be a Toon material. And just like that, we have that full Toon look to things. Right. So that works great, but the question again is, how do you apply this at scale? Well, in Cinema 4D, you'll want to throw the outline material in the outline override slot again. And the Toon material, you'll want that in the material override slot. And just like that, everything in the scene is driven by the outline and the Toon materials. Now in 3ds Max, the procedure, as you might have guessed already, is much the same. So the outline material goes in the outline override slot, and the Toon material goes into the regular material override slot. Again, this way you can easily apply a global Toon look along with the outlines. Now granted, you could also just plug the outline plus Toon material combo right into the global material override slot, and that would work just fine as well, but you would lose out on the fact that the outline override only overrides the outlines and not the base material, whereas the global material override would literally override all the materials with the outline material setup, and so the base material would get overridden as well. Right, so those are the basics, and just to do a very short recap, you got the outline material for the outlines, and you got the Toon material for the Toon shading look. And you can apply these materials on individual objects in your scenes, or you can use the overrides. As a fun but important note, this feature set is well suited for creating still images and also for creating animations. So don't be afraid to go all toony with your animations as well, as the features are designed to work that way as well. Okay, so that just about covers the very basics, and in the next few minutes, we'll be taking a look at some quick tips and tricks, in no particular order, mind you, to kind of showcase some of the things you can do with the new Toon system. We'll start with a quick breakdown of some of the most useful parameters inside the outline material. Outline color is what defines the color of the universe. Not, obviously, it's pretty straightforward. It defines the color of the outlines, right? Plain and simple. The outline texture slot is where you can put in a texture for the outlines instead of a color, which is something you'll probably want to do if you want the hand-drawn look, as an example, right? Then there's the outline width that has an option for percentage-based width definition, a fixed pixel one, and one that you define in world units. So basically, these are the three different ways to define how the outline thickness gets calculated. And the actual thickness then gets defined, well, by the actual number you input in here. Opacity is another thing you'll often probably want to use, because if you plug a texture in here, you can get this really nice, well, in this case, hand-drawn look going. Now, as a note, the outline material by default gets affected by the VFB tone mapping stack. And if you don't want that, you can disable that by playing with these, well, rather self-explanatory toggles here. We've had a few users already that were surprised by these being on by default. So we might change how they're toggled on by default in the future, but we'll see where that consensus ends up being. All right, so that was the outline material 101. Next up, let's take a look at the Toon material, and this one has a couple of additional settings. Okay, so we're going to start in 3ds Max here, but if you're a Cinema 4D user, we would highly encourage you to pay attention now as well. But do know that there's going to be a Cinema 4D section following right after the 3ds Max section. Okay, so we're going to start with the diffuse color parameter here. Now, if we set it to a red color, well, then our Toon material is going to look red, right? And so the way that this works is it basically gives your Toon material a color to specify in here. And so I guess you could just say that it works pretty much the same way that the base layer's color does in the Corona physical material. Then we've got the roughness parameter. If you set this to a really high value, the reflections on the Toon material are going to get rougher looking. If you set this to a really low value, well, then the reflections are going to look glossier. Okay. Then you have this IOR parameter here with which you can control the IOR for the material. Higher values, the IOR is going to be higher. Things are going to look more reflective. But if you set the IOR value to 1, well, then you're effectively disabling the reflections, right? And so for certain Toon styles, for certain Toon shaded looks, this is exactly what you will want. You will want to disable the reflections, and you can do that very easily just by simply setting the IOR to a value of 1.0. Okay? Okay, then we've got the ambient color parameter. I'm just going to set it to green here. Okay, and now as you can see, our Toon material that is applied to everything in this artsy epic scene that we have here. And as you can see, this Toon material got green tinted. So you can think of the ambient color essentially as the sort of all-encompassing environmental light that hits your material from every possible direction, right? And so in this case, that light is green tinted, and so everything, well, the Toon material is green tinted. Now, obviously, this is done inside the material itself, so it's not like there's an actual light that's going to cast shadows or whatever. No, this is just essentially like having a all-encompassing environmental light that just hits your material from every possible direction, whether it's occluded or not occluded. Okay, but now, as you've probably noticed, there's some tint to our setup here. And why is that? Well, check this out. We currently have our diffuse color for our Toon material here set to red, right? And then if you think of this ambient color here as this sort of environmental light that casts this green sort of light across our material, obviously we're going to get some tinting, right? So if we go inside the diffuse color here and we set the diffuse color to a completely black color, well, now everything has this flat green tinted look, right? Okay, Another thing to remember with the ambient color itself is that the ambient color only affects direct rays and not the global illumination rays. So if you have some intense global illumination, light color bleeding and bouncing, etc., that will also affect the tinting. And so it's important to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so for now I'm going to set the ambient color to black, and now let's focus on the next thing here on our list, which is the diffuse ramp, I guess, set of parameters. Now what the diffuse ramp essentially does is it controls the surface color relative to the angle from the light sources in your scene. You can sort of think of it as the towards and away option inside the fall off map itself. Okay, so let's get a little bit closer to our sphere here, and I'm gonna move this knot more towards the right. And now, as you can see, we're introducing more of this black color into the ramp here, and as you can already see in the preview and in the rendered image, our material is now more encompassed by this black color that we've set here. If we move the knot more towards the left, well then, as you can see, the opposite happens, right? And so this way, as an example, you can control those fake toon shadows that you see on well, with some toon styles, right? Or what you can also do is you can, if you add new knots in here, you can just introduce more color into the mix. So I'm just gonna give this a bit of a green tinted addition, and now as you can see, we're adding this sort of green tint to the mix. This diffuse ramp can be quite powerful, but it does require experimentation, and since this is a bit of a short tutorial, we're just gonna leave it at that. Okay, next up we have the specular ramp set of parameters, and the way that they work is very similar to how the diffuse ramp works. So you have this ramp here with which you can control how those specular reflections behave, right? So very similar behavior to what we saw with the diffuse ramp itself. Okay, then we've got the refraction here and the opacity, which we all probably know how they work by now. We also have displacement, etc. But one parameter that you probably maybe don't already know how it works is the light color replacement here. So if I enable it and give it a bit of a color, I'm going to give it a bit of a green tint. Okay, well now, before we start explaining what's happening, let's also increase the blend intensity here to 1. Okay, so now essentially what's happening is we are replacing the illumination from the actual light sources in our scene with this green tinted color. Okay, and so obviously we then also have different blending options here that we can play with, and the blend intensity, so how much of this color we're using to replace the actual light that's coming from the actual light sources in our scene, etc. Now, the way that this differs compared to the ambient color is that the ambient color just sort of fakes this all-encompassing light hitting your material from every direction, occlusions are not being taken into the account and all that, whereas the light color replacement literally replaces the illuminating light that's coming from your light sources with this color using this blend type and this blend intensity. Okay, so it's literally taking the illumination that's being cast out of our actual light source in the scene with this color right here that you set. Okay, and in a nutshell, that's the Toon material and its basic most settings. Now in Cinema 4D, the workflow is pretty much exactly the same. It's just laid out differently, right? So here we've got our base color. We're going to set it to red, much like we did in 3ds Max. So now our Toon material is red. We've got the ambient color we can play around with, right, if we so want to. But in this case, we're just gonna leave it disabled or set to black. We've got the roughness we can play with, and the IOR value, which again, just to really stress this, if you set the IOR value to 1.0 or 1, well then you're effectively disabling the reflections, which in a lot of the Toon shading style looks, this might be something that you want to do, or it might not be. Again, really it depends on the type of look you're going for. Then we've got the diffuse ramp, which acts exactly the same as it does in 3ds Max. And the same can be said for the specular ramp and all the other parameters. Now, refraction, light color replacement, opacity, and displacement are in C4D split into their own channels. So if you want refraction control, you first need to enable the channel, then you can play around with it in here, right? So opacity, we kind of already at this point know how it works. Same can be said for displacement. Maybe we can just stop here in the light color replacement channel. So if we enable it, it works exactly the same as it does in 3ds Max, right? So we're going to give this a green color. We're going to increase the blend intensity to 100%. And now all the illuminating properties coming from our corona light, which is right here in the top left corner, all the illuminating properties are getting replaced by this color that we set here, and you got the different kinds of blending modes, etc., etc. So the workflow is pretty much the same as it is in 3ds Max. It's just that things are laid out differently. All right, this next tip is rather obvious, but regardless of how exactly you've set up your material overrides, don't forget you've got your include excludes available to you for all the override options, right? So this can be very useful, for example, if you want 3/4 of the scene to be overridden by a specific material, but then there's certain parts of the scene where you'll want a special toon or outline material applied. Like in our case here, where the vegetation on the left just looks way too thick with the current outlines. Now, by excluding that vegetation from being affected by the outline override, we can throw a custom outline material on these things in 1x1 fashion. In our specific case here, a less thick outline. Okay, so next we'll talk a little bit about lighting, because that does affect how the toon look behaves. Broadly speaking, small and or directional light sources will cause a sharper edge to the toon posterization effect, whereas larger or less directional light sources will cause more of a softer blurred edge in the posterization. So because of that, if you're going for a well-developed toon look for your final renders, you'll probably want to spend some time thinking about the lighting in the scene. Needless to say, with photoreal setups, you'll typically want realistic lighting, whereas working in toon style might require a different approach depending on the specific look you're after, of course. For example, using non-photoreal default lights from 3ds Max or Cinema 4D in place of Corona's lights, that can allow you to further emphasize or adjust the toon look. So that's something to very much keep in mind. All right, as another quick tip, one thing you might have noticed is that when applying a single toon material to everything in your scene, the things start looking a bit monotone. If you still want to use overrides but want to introduce a bit more variation to things, well then consider taking a Corona multimap / Corona multishader and plug it into the diffuse slot of the toon material. This way, you can define multiple colors that will be applied throughout the scene, and thus you get a bit more of a varied look. Don't forget though, how the colors get applied can be defined inside the multimap's properties. And if you want, you can even give specific objects a specific color by simply going with the, for example, the object buffer ID option and then giving the desired objects that ID. Now, the same technique can also be applied to outlines as well, where you plug the multi-thing into the outline materials color slot to define, in this case, the color of the outlines. Or you can also plug it into the line width slot to define variations in line width. Or if you plug some textures into it, you can also plug it into the opacity slot, which then means each object in the scene can have its own outline style. So kind of bottom line, there's lots of stuff you can do with this new toon system if you just go out and, I guess, experiment with it. Talking about outlines, another cool thing you can do is you can leverage a distance map / shader to define how thick the outlines are relative to your camera's position. This way, you can have outlines that are thicker when they are closer to the camera and thinner when they are farther away, or vice versa, of course. And while this can be a cool look for still images, it can be extra cool when seen in motion, aka with animations such as, admittedly, the super crude example animation that we've prepared here. But hopefully this kind of encouraged you to explore the things you can do with this toon system, right? Now, another quick tip is to also try experimenting with render settings. Remember, by default, Corona is set up for photorealistic rendering. And so if you're doing toon rendering, it might make sense to maybe lower some of the settings. For example, you can try lowering the max sample intensity and max ray depth parameters to 1, for example. And with that, what you're doing is you're limiting a bit of those secondary GI bounces. And this can be useful in case you want less GI, less global illumination in your scene, which is sometimes what is desired with toon styled renders. So bottom line here, there's a lot to experiment with when it comes to the toon look in Corona, and a lot of it does come down to the type of look you're after. Now, we do hope you like what Corona 13 brings to the table in terms of toon functionality. We know a lot of you have been requesting it, and well, we do hope the team has delivered. There's updates planned for toon, and so if you have any suggestions, go ahead and cast your votes over on the Corona Ideas portal. We would really welcome that. And with that, I guess we're at the tail end of this tutorial, or featureal rather. Thank you so much for sticking by. We hope you've learned something new here, and we'll see you in the next one.